Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. Today I want to talk a little bit about irony, which is defined on this handout, which I've featured in past videos, as a statement in which the meaning implied differs sharply from the meaning which is expressed. Now, that's a pretty straightforward definition and one that applies really to a wide range of situations. The most direct and most obvious kind of irony we might think of as sarcasm. If someone asks, "How are you doing?" and I say with a pretty harsh tone of voice, "Oh, I'm fine," that's of course I'm being sarcastic, and um, hopefully the person who I'm in conversation with will recognize that. And often, if it's a friend, they don't even need to spend much time thinking about whether or not I mean it. They know I don't, and that I'm actually communicating the opposite. Irony, of course, can also be dramatic, meaning when, say, the reader or the audience knows more than a character does in a film. When I'm watching a Shakespearean tragedy, for instance, I have a pretty good sense of what's probably going to happen by the end of the play. Or if I'm watching a romantic comedy, I have a pretty good sense of where that's going to wind up simply because of my insights into the genre. And so there's a way in which, in that sense, because I know the genre, I know more than the characters do about the fate that awaits them. Probably an example I am more prone to use in classes I teach when I'm helping students grapple with the idea of dramatic irony might be a moment in a horror movie where the electricity in someone's house goes out and they all rush upstairs, or they decide to split up and search the house or something. We all, again, as audience members, because we know we're watching a certain kind of movie and we maybe have seen enough of these, know we know what's in store for them. And of course, the common kind of trope, even that inserts itself in movies itself, is of a movie theater full of people who yell at the screen, "Don't go up there! Don't open that door!" And that's partly because we are hip to or reacting to the kind of dramatic irony that it is infusing that scene. In the sort of middle of the 20th century, the new critic Cleanth Brooks wrote an essay called "Irony as a Principle of Structure." Uh, and even though it's not a very sexy title, this is an essay I often assign in my graduate courses and sometimes my undergraduate courses in criticism and theory. And I don't do it because I am completely on board with everything that Cleanth Brooks says. Much of his writing is reactionary, pretty conservative, and yet his approach to and his thought about the structure of something like metaphor and the relationship between metaphor and irony at a pretty fundamental level, and how that organizes his own approach to poetry has been pretty influential to me. So I thought I might just scroll through a few moments of his essay. There's a pretty famous moment in the essay where he comes out and says that the different parts of a poem are related to each other in a kind of organic relationship. He says here, the elements of a poem are related to each other not as blossoms juxtaposed in a bouquet, but as the blossoms are related to other parts of a growing plant. And then he moves on, shifts pretty quickly to think about poems as little dramas. And this really organizes pretty much the rest of his essay, where he plays out the thought experiment of thinking about individual lyric poems as if they were existing in a larger play, uh, and that the significance of any given line is not internal to itself, but related to the situation in which it's being said, and the ways in which the whole poem puts pressure on that line. So he says here, most emphatically, poems never contain abstract statements that are just true out of context. He clarifies that as any statement made in the poem bears the pressure of the context and has its meaning modified by the context. And so this is why he calls irony a principle of structure for poetry. that irony for him isn't just about individual statements. Irony infuses how meaning is even made in a poem at all. Um, and then if we scroll down even further, let's think about how he ends. He ends by suggesting that the stability of a poem, the stability of a statement is kind of like the stability of an arch. So you can see he's given several similes to try to get at what he's saying. A simile that leans into natural and organic imagery, a simile that thinks about poems with respect to drama, and then poetry with respect um, to arches, to sort of to sculpture and architecture, where he says the stability of a poem is like that of the arch. The very forces which are calculated to drag the stones to the ground actually provide the principle of support, a principle in which thrust and counter thrust become the means of stability. And so for him, for Brooks, this is why he's often drawn to words like paradox, intention, ambiguity, because he sees and metaphor, because he sees these instances where meaning becomes potentially confused or complicated or at odds as precisely the moments where we should direct our eyes and think about how they put pressure on even some of the more straightforward statements in a poem. This often means that he thinks about the endings of poems quite a lot and how we are to make sense of them. So we might think of the famous conclusion of a poem like John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, where the speaker ends with these lines: "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." And one thing Brooks writes about, he has a pretty famous essay about this poem. One thing he tries to dismiss is any effort to turn these last two lines into a general philosophical principle. That if we extract these from the context of the poem, they actually are it's actually a pretty nonsensical statement. And if you build a whole aesthetics on it, or a whole moral philosophy on it, or a whole system of values on it, that is the last thing you should probably be doing with this poem. That what you should instead be thinking about is how all the stanzas of Keats's complicated poem pressure what we're to make of of these final two lines, if we are to take them seriously, what angle from which to read them, or from what angles we should be reading them. And Keats maybe already signals this to us, even if we back up to the last three lines, because because these lines are not just simply in the poem, but are put in quotation marks. So something to think about there. And for Brooks, then this means that it's not just that the meaning of the statement is different than its literal content, but that there's something fundamental to the structure, at least of verse poetry or verse lyric, that means that you have to treat almost every line this way. And that if you think about it, almost every device that we think of as poetic, for instance, metaphor, relies on this kind of sensitivity. I'm getting yelled at by Casimir. Hey, buddy, you want to come up on the table? No? His demands are pretty straightforward, he says. They are not ironical. Okay, we see a similar kind of ending in Derek Walcott's poem Sea Grapes. He has a whole collection that goes by this title as well. And after a lovely poem written in almost entirely in tercets, that's drawing attention to the relationship between sort of classic antiquity, the epic poetry of Homer, and the kind of a potential domestic life of infidelity. He ends with this line, which is separated out, is not part of a tercet. The classics can console, hard pause, but not enough. You can imagine kind of extracting this, putting it as an epigraph to something, approaching it as if it's a thesis statement about the importance of classic literature, especially to generations and to places in the world to which it's not necessarily part of one's tradition or familiar to one. Uh, but Brooks would insist that we don't just extract this line, we think about it with respect to the tercets that lead up to it. And that we might even ask the questions like the ones he offers here at the end of his essay. Does the speaker seem carried away with his own emotions? Does he seem to oversimplify the situation? Or does he, on the other hand, seem to have won a kind of detachment and objectivity? Um, I mean, these are questions you would ask of someone, say, delivering a soliloquy on stage. But it's also something I think that Brooks tries to answer by paying attention to the chain of meaning that runs through a poem, especially at the level of metaphor, of simile, of comparison, of substitution, of the kind of clashing registers of imagery and meaning that the poem is holding up. Okay. We could also think about this with respect to a poem that was recently featured on Poetry Daily. This is The Blood Milk is Life is Poetry by Imogen Smith. It's a fantastic poem which includes some of the best lines I have read in recent memory. What do I mean by that? Best lines I've read in recent memory. Best lines of contemporary poetry that I've read recently. I mean, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but just consider the opening few lines here. Um, I want a garden, something modest, and need not feed the century. Tomatoes, cukes, snap peas, melon fruits, squash easily grown. Dip a finger for seedlings in soil, dip another, and surely as time pass, spring rewraps the skeletal, flogs ass all summer, till it's death red, death orange, death yellow, death crisp, death ice. Anyway, look at this line right here. My gosh. Time pass, rewraps, flogs ass, just so great. Anyway, the poem, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but you'll see that this poem too ends with lines that you could think of as being extracted, maybe even printed on a shirt or something. You must stay open and railable. Don't reign 40 days like a sullen god, but do it some, right? Now, of course, even on its own, that might not make much sense if you don't read the whole poem, but I think extracted one could start to intuit what the poet is after, and certainly this penultimate line you could see as potentially extractable as a kind of life motto or life philosophy. But Brooks, again, for all his association with pretty reactionary and conservative politics, he gives us a way to think about how to read verse poetry with a kind of care and sensitivity to its madeness as something that has been crafted, something that, despite um, efforts to transgress certain conventions, um, is still kind of held together with a kind of uh, integrity tied to something we might think of as structural irony. All the pieces, even if they're combating each other, also supporting each other, at least in the project of making meaning, or again, the project of reaching out to another mind, another person who isn't necessarily present at the crafting of the poem. And if they're to reckon with what to make of it, if they're at least maybe to study it a little bit, one thing they might pay attention to is how the whole poem is not just a text, but is itself a kind of context, is itself a kind of ecosystem in which the different pieces, the different life forms, um, don't have to get along, but certainly rely on each other in order to mean anything at all. So, next time you think about something like the difference between denotation, connotation, the difference between literal language and figurative language, when you think of something like metaphor or simile or metonymy, think about how something called irony, or something that Brooks, I think, somewhat hesitantly wants to call irony, runs through all of that. And part of the magic of language is how we're able to mean so much by saying it kind of indirectly, and how much what is said relies on the situation or context in which it's said, and how much it relies on other things that are said in a kind of proximity to it. All right. Well, maybe I'll come back to one of these poems in a future video. Um, what do you, but until then, I'm going to wrap this up. What do you think of irony when you think of irony, especially with respect to literature or to poetry? What poems come to mind? And how does the idea of irony maybe help you reckon with and grapple with, or at least just simply study what might be going on the page?